What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into, or I guess really kind of continuing our discussion on the Marvel cosmic landscape, Infinity War, different things like that, I want to switch over to the character of Gamora, and I want to offer this explanation on her because we've never really talked about Gamora in depth. We've talked about stories that she's been in, but we've never really done a character explanation on her. So Gamora first appeared back in Strange Tales issue number 180 in 1975, and she was created by Jim Starlin. Now, in our video about Adam Warlock, we had talked about how his character had gone through these sort of phases, which is to say he was originally introduced in Fantastic Four, and then of course he appeared in Thor. In the early days, in those two stories, the Fantastic Four and Thor, he was only known as him. He was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and the idea was to introduce Warlock as a character who was kind of figuring out the nature of things. He was very much a newborn being who had these almost, nigh omnipotent abilities. It was really kind of hinted to that he could be virtually unstoppable if he ever achieved his full potential. Now, of course, following these two stories in Fantastic Four and Thor, he was rolled over into his own solo series in The Power of Warlock 1 through 8. And of course, this dealt with the idea of his character kind of being revamped, turned into a messianic character. The issue with this was that with issue number 8, The Power of Warlock was canceled, and then effectively Jim Starlin took over the character in Strange Tales issues 180, 181, going through into the newly launched Warlock series, which was just kind of continuing on the numbering, so it was Warlock 9 through 15. And the whole idea behind this was that Gamora was part and parcel to this whole attempt by Jim Starlin to expand the Marvel cosmic landscape. Remember, back in the 1970s and 1980s, really going into like Infinity Gauntlet in the 1990s, while you did have cosmic characters out there, it wasn't really a unified thing. There was no real like greater Marvel cosmology, and there wasn't really like, this sort of coherent system where it all sort of comes together, and at any point in time, you can see all these different solo series. Instead, you just kind of had these characters who would just be out there. You would have Quasar, and you would have Marvel of the Kree, and you'd have these stories here and there. You might have some Galactus stories, you might have some Silver Surfer stories, and that was really about it. The works of Jim Starlin, and the reason why they were so important back during the 1970s and 1980s was because he laid the foundation for what writers like Dan Abnett would do later on, where they would grab all these different cosmic characters and they would consolidate them all back into a singular cohesive unit that would be the Marvel cosmic landscape. And so with the character of Gamora, again, because she was part and parcel to this really deals with what a lot of Adam Warlock fans refer to as the Magus Saga. Now, this really kind of picked up in Strange Tales 180 and 181, running into the Warlock second iteration of his solo series. And the whole idea behind this was that Jim Starlin had introduced the idea that where Adam Warlock had the Soul Stone, that a time would eventually come when he would be corrupted by it. He would basically be driven insane, and he would eventually become a being called the Magus, who would have an amazing afro. And the whole idea behind this was that the Magus would form something called the Universal Church of Truth. And the Universal Church of Truth would simply just kind of be hell-bent on universal domination. That's really all it would do. Those individuals who didn't convert to the Universal Church of Truth were eradicated. Those who did were inducted into its ranks and bolstered the population of the church, allowing it to swell in number and expand its ever-increasing role. Now, with regards to Magus himself, because he was effectively from the future, and he was a future version of what Adam Warlock would be, this allowed Jim Starlin to kind of maneuver the pieces in the chessboard, so to speak, to kind of cook the books a bit in order to introduce characters who normally wouldn't have a reason to be introduced. For Gamora's introduction in issue number 180 and 181, there wasn't really a whole lot given about her initially. In fact, it would be about 3 or 4 issues before she would actually get an explanation. Instead, she simply just showed up saying that she was looking for Adam Warlock. Now, of course, by this point, Adam Warlock had been taken prisoner by the Universal Church of Truth. They were really kind of putting him through the paces to ensure that the conditioning would go through and eventually he would become the Magus, basically guaranteeing his existence. But because of the fact that Warlock had basically been taken by the Universal Church, it simply meant that, Pip the Troll, who had actually been introduced in Strange Tales 179, I think it was, had basically just sort of been off on his own. Now, of course, Gamora running into him was one of these interesting scenarios because occasionally she would report back to and communicate with someone called the Master, and that was really about it. But one of the first things Starlin fleshed out is that Gamora is the deadliest woman in the galaxy, that if it really comes down to it, no one's going to be able to stop her. Now, when she initially arrives alongside Pip the Troll to the Universal Church, one of the Black Knights, who are really kind of like the soldiers, the foot soldiers of the Universal Church, immediately recognizes Gamora for what she is and absolutely begins to panic. And that's when Jim Starlin starts to get into this idea that there's a lot more to her character than we're initially being led on to believe. And so because of the fact that we ultimately have this showdown that took place between Adam Warlock and between Magus, and basically it led to the idea that Adam Warlock was essentially thrown into a place called the Pit where he was going to be driven insane until he actually became the Magus. It effectively meant that Gamora wasn't able to save Adam Warlock and kill the Magus. The other half of this was that Gamora initially wasn't really sensed by the Magus, meaning he couldn't actually see her. This was explained in Warlock issue number 10. And the reason why is because of the fact that we end up learning the master that Gamora is reporting to is actually Thanos himself. And the whole idea behind this, it, really kind of comes in her origin story, which is a little strange, and it actually is fixed later on down the line. But it's simply this idea that at some point in the future, Gamora's race, called the Whoberi, I think is what they're called, they were basically met by the Universal Church of Truth. And the Universal Church tried to convert them to their own belief system, and the Whoberi declined. The result was that all of them were eradicated with the exception of Gamora. But because Thanos realized that Adam Warlock would become the Magus, Thanos took the character of Gamora, brought her back to the modern day, effectively taking her out of an alternate reality, and it sort of hoped that by virtue of doing so, that she would kind of exist outside of time, quote unquote, meaning that Magus wouldn't actually be able to see her. She'd effectively be a ghost as far as he's concerned. Now, of course, Magus did sense her presence, but chose to ignore her because the most important thing was to focus on Adam Warlock. But with Gamora, Pip the Troll, and Thanos working alongside each other to free Adam Warlock and then going on to defeat the Magus, thus ends in issue number 15, the Magus Saga, basically meaning he's defeated. Now, of course, at the conclusion of all this, it also ties in the idea that Adam Warlock will never be able to eliminate the soul gem. He'll always have to keep it because it's basically kind of absorbed a fraction of his soul for the most part, and so he's part and parcel to the gem itself. That's why the soul gem really kind of goes hand in hand with Adam Warlock, because a part of his soul is effectively inside the soul stone. He can never really get rid of it. It would be like getting rid of an arm or a leg or something like that. He would lose part of himself in the process. Now again, because of the fact that this was an attempt by Jim Starlin to sort of build this cosmic landscape, the story as it appeared in Strange Tales 179 through 181, running all the way up from Warlock issue number 9 to issue number 15, also ran part and parcel to a series of events that were unfolding in the Captain Marvel stories. And these all basically came to a head in Avengers Annual issue number 7 and Marvel 2-in-1. I cannot remember what issue it was, but it was basically the first time Thanos grabbed the Infinity Stones. And the idea was that the intention of Thanos in defeating, or at least seeing the defeat of the Magus, was basically to form an alliance of sorts with Adam Warlock so he could steal Adam Warlock's Soul Stone. And so the intention of Thanos was to basically merge all the Infinity Stones together and then form a giant stone and blink out all the stars in the universe. Now again, this is in the early days of Thanos' character and before he learned about the Infinity Gauntlet. And so because of the fact that Thanos had basically tasked Gamora with allying herself and really being a bodyguard of sorts to Adam Warlock in order to make sure he stays safe so that Thanos could steal the Soul Stone when he needs to, this created an alliance of sorts that Jim Starlin built on. And so what this meant was that following the defeat of Thanos, basically Adam Warlock retreating to Soul World, Gamora went along with him as well as Pip the Troll. And what this did is it actually fast forwarded a bit and it took us into the story of Infinity Gauntlet. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here: the transportation of the essences of Gamora and Pip the Troll and Adam Warlock, that was really done by virtue of the fact that their physical forms had quote unquote died. And so in order to kind of keep their essences alive, they were just transported to Soul World. And again, Soul World is just kind of a place where people who were formerly enemies or even friends of Adam Warlock, they all just kind of lived in a peaceful coexistence, beings like Krator and different things like that. But the whole idea behind this is that it actually just kind of allowed Jim Starlin to sit them on the back burner for a time, to basically say, okay, we finished the Magus Saga, let's take Gamora, let's take Pip the Troll, let's take Adam Warlock, and let's just sit them back here until we bring them back. Now again, because of the fact that a lot of these things dealt with stories like Thanos Quest and so on and so forth, continuing this cosmology and kind of building up to the Infinity Gauntlet story, the return of Gamora, Pip the Troll, and Adam Warlock really came by way of a visit from the Silver Surfer, who was basically responding to the idea that Thanos had learned about the Infinity Gauntlet, he had gained all the Infinity Stones, and he had effectively become God. And so it was really Silver Surfer in a position where he was just kind of traversing the spaceways, trying to find help wherever he could. Now, of course, this ultimately led into Silver Surfer crash landing into the Sanctum Sanctorum of Doctor Strange, and then this kind of set things in motion for the main Infinity Gauntlet story. But the coolest thing about this was that, again, because Jim Starlin was writing so much of this, there really isn't a whole lot of deviation in terms of stories that were done about Gamora, in terms of things that, involved her character, with anybody else really taking up the reins. Instead, what this did is it went into the Infinity Gauntlet story proper, which, as we all pretty much know, saw the return of Adam Warlock, Pip the Troll, and Gamora. They were simply thrown into the bodies of 3 deceased people. It allowed Jim Starlin to return them to the Marvel Universe with more power than they had before, and then that event unfolded as most all of us are used to. Now, of course, because of the fact that Infinity Gauntlet ended with the defeat of Thanos at the hands of Nebula, and then ultimately Adam Warlock taking the gauntlet for himself. In the aftermath to the Infinity Gauntlet story, effectively Adam Warlock was put on trial by the cosmic entities. And it was this idea that because Adam Warlock didn't really look to replace Eternity as the most powerful being in the universe, ultimately the Living Tribunal, second only to the One Above All, basically shut down the Infinity Gauntlet, disabled the Infinity Stones, and then told Adam Warlock to disperse them evenly so that the Infinity Stones could never be brought back together. And if they were, it wouldn't matter because the Infinity Gauntlet would never work. And so this led directly into a line of comics called Warlock and the Infinity Watch. Now, Warlock and the Infinity Watch was a very big deal when it came to the character of Gamora, because this was designed in a lot of ways to effectively be a team book. With Jim Starlin writing Warlock and the Infinity Watch between issues 1 to 31, running between 1992 to 1994, roughly, the whole idea behind this was that where the story was for the most part monthly, becoming bi-monthly during the events of Infinity War and kind of crossing over with those stories, a lot of the background that came with Gamora really covered her early days alongside Thanos. You know, when Thanos had basically taken her from the now extinct Whoberi and then took her under his wing and began going through and teaching her the kind of things she needed to know. A lot of this dealt with the idea that Gamora was kind of learning her place for the most part. It was this concept that Gamora would go forward, that Thanos would really be kind of cold to her in a lot of different ways. He saw her as a weapon and he groomed her that way. There was actually a particular story, and I do not remember which issue it is in Warlock and the Infinity Watch. I want to say it's issue number 4 or 5 or something like that, but it's basically a point whereby she goes on a mission and actually ignores Thanos. And the result is that she's graphically assaulted by a handful of thugs. Thanos kills them all and then gives her cybernetic implants. And that's when it starts to go into the idea that Thanos had made these genetic modifications to Gamora to basically enhance her abilities, so that where she gained prodigious fighting experience, where she was one of the deadliest people out there in terms of all manner of weapons use and different things like that, that Thanos had modified her using cybernetic implants to push her that much further. Now, while Jim Starlin focused on a lot of elements with regards to the background of Gamora, in the modern day, there were also a lot of things that were designed to kind of build her character in the presence, because in truth, when it came to 1990s comics, especially with characters like Gamora, the cosmic landscape, again, we're talking about uncharted waters for the most part. And because the largest emphasis from Marvel was put on earthbound superheroes, it sort of allowed Jim Starlin to kind of get away with things that we wouldn't normally expect. And so a lot of the things that he developed were things like a potential romance between Gamora and Adam Warlock. Ultimately, it didn't work out initially, removing, Gamora from the Infinity Watch just to see what would happen with regards to changing up different members of the team. The idea that she was experiencing some measure of clairvoyancy. It was different things like that that were designed to kind of experiment with her character. It was literally this sort of catch-all. It was grabbing all these different themes and seeing what fans enjoyed. Now, at the same time, this also dealt with, really Jim Starlin kind of going off and writing these various spin-off Infinity stories. And Infinity Abyss was really one of the early 2000s stories that introduced a character named Atlaza, who basically went on to become the kind of custodian of the multiverse, which is a very ambiguous role. It's something to do with making sure the multiverse never sinks into oblivion or something along those lines. It's not a fully fleshed out ideology. It's just one of those instances where Thanos kind of just created a multiversal being just to explain the nature of the story. But it dealt with the idea that because a romance was actually forming between Adam Warlock and Gamora, it wasn't necessarily a happily ever after kind of thing, like writing them off into a world of enjoyment, so much as it was just kind of leaving things, to a point where somebody else could kind of pick up the slack. And the result was that when it came to Gamora and Adam Warlock, with Atlaza standing in and basically becoming the new custodian of the multiverse, what it meant is someone had to raise her outside of all space and time to basically ensure that she could understand what it meant to play that role. And so it effectively allowed Jim Starlin to write the characters of Gamora and Adam Warlock out of the main Marvel universe and into basically a litany of other stories that he wanted to write involving those characters that wouldn't really see any major changes or ramifications and kind of see them removed from the main Marvel line of comics. And so for quite some time, really I'd say about 4 or 5 years, between 2002 and 2006, there wasn't really a whole lot going on with Gamora in the main Marvel universe. All you really had was her appearing in these various Infinity stories and these various, cosmic stories were written by Jim Starlin, Marvel The End, different things like that. The reason why this matters is because, as we've said, in 2006, writer Dan Abnett came along and basically said, okay, let's grab all these characters, these cosmic characters who have been evolved over the years by one writer or another, and we're going to bring them all together. And the launch pad he used to introduce those things into this larger landscape was the story of Annihilation. Now, where Annihilation was designed to, again, be this sort of coming together of these various forces with regards to, cosmic beings and really cosmic entities and different things like that, for the character of Gamora, there wasn't a whole lot going on with her. Instead, she just kind of blended in with a lot of other people who were doing various things. I mean, Annihilation dealt with Annihilus and the Annihilation Wave and all those different things spreading across the universe and trying to wipe out all life and so on and so forth. She fought alongside the UFN, the United Front of Nova, or something along those lines. I think that's what it's called. As far as Annihilation goes, she was just one of a multitude of characters there. In truth, it almost seemed like the days of focusing explicitly on Gamora had long since passed, but in truth, Dan Abnett and company actually brought her back into the fold when it came to the Phalanx and the Annihilation Conquest story. Now, of course, Annihilation Conquest dealt with the idea of Ultron basically trying to conquer the universe. It was an incredibly good story, but what Ultron would do by way of the Phalanx is, because the Phalanx are just kind of like the Borg from Star Trek is really the best way to think about it, because they're just kind of like this spacefaring cybernetic race. The idea is that they would basically just kind of assimilate every single being they came across. But those individuals who possessed a heightened level of skill, whether it was hand-to-hand combat or whether it was the ability to manipulate energy, they would basically be the select. And what this would mean is they would be, assimilated into the Phalanx, but they would be allowed some measure of autonomy, meaning they'd be able to go out and do their own thing, but it would all be done for the purpose of expanding the Phalanx. Where Gamora was basically assimilated by the Phalanx group itself, what this meant was that it allowed her to kind of go forward for the purpose of trying to bring in Richard Rider. And that's really where a lot of the development after Jim Starlin began to take place when it came to her character. This idea that there was a kind of attractiveness to her. The element of the character that you saw in Guardians of the Galaxy in the movie, for the most part, the idea that she had somewhat of a softer side, all that stuff was really fleshed out in the later works of Jim Starlin and heavily done by the work of Dan Abnett in the Annihilation Conquest story. Now, of course, ultimately she was freed from her captivity. This romantic tension between herself and Nova really began to sort of fade away, and the two of them went their own separate ways. But following the events of Annihilation Conquest, because of the fact that Dan Abnett has sort of pulled this huge story together that saw this coming together of all these heroes and just how dire the situation could be with regards to what would happen if things really went awry in the universe, the idea was to begin breaking things down into smaller scales. And so where a lot of this saw things like Richard Rider, for example, is the last surviving member of the Nova Corps, basically going on and having the Nova Force all to himself, trying to reform the Nova Corps, different things like that. It also focused with the creation of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, the Guardians of the Galaxy had existed in terms of Guardians of the Galaxy 3000, but in terms of the modern day team that you guys think of, that wasn't really formed until after the events of Annihilation Conquest. And it was a lot of these characters who had kind of been brought together and simply said, we need to have a team that will basically safeguard the universe should things begin to go awry. But the whole idea behind focusing on Gamora as part of the Guardians was to kind of look at her and say, how does she fit in a situation like this? How does it work when someone who's basically a lone wolf for the most part, kind of a lone warrior, is really brought in to work alongside a team? And it was interesting because there were a lot of funny moments when it came to bickering, when it came to infighting, all those different concepts, sort of putting her in a position where she was constantly trying to break away from her history with Thanos, going out and to forge her own path, different things like that. A lot of these themes that have been built on over the years were really starting to come to a head with regards to these particular stories. Now again, because of the fact that, Dan Abnett's work only went on for so long, and things like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 by Brian Michael Bendis began the process of coming in and making some changes, where Gamora was a major focal point of the team for quite some time. In truth, under Brian Michael Bendis and his relatively short run, the idea of Guardians of the Galaxy for him was doing things like expanding on Star-Lord, Jason of Spartax, and the whole idea that Earth had basically been blocked off, that nobody was allowed to go to Earth. For the most part, Gamora didn't really play a huge part. There were some funny moments, when Iron Man showed up, joined the Guardians of the Galaxy for a time, he and Gamora kind of got together and she was a lot more than Iron Man could handle. When it comes to these funny little moments and things like that, it is cool and it is pretty interesting. You had small little moments here and there where her character would become relatively popular and great things would happen, but for the most part, she was largely just kind of now a background character in the Marvel Cosmic. And that's one of the benefits, but also one of the drawbacks that you find when there's this sort of coming together of all these different themes, that there's very little room to have characters who aren't wildly huge, who aren't massively significant, they're not legacy characters, and make them important. Star-Lord is important because he was effectively the leader of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Characters like Thanos were important because of stories like Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War, Infinity Abyss, different things like that. But for characters like Gamora, she was just another person who was there. And so the result was that going into Bendis's run with the introduction of Angela from the Spawn universe, grabbing these different concepts, rolling Gamora over, it was constantly reminding people that, Gamora is pretty dangerous. She is a formidable assassin, but for the most part, aside from rescuing Abigail Brand or something along those lines, or maybe, pairing up with Agent Venom when he joined the Guardians, that was really about it. Now, stories like Black Vortex were cool when she basically gained these sort of cosmic powers, but again, by 2012, 2013, 2014, Marvel was winding down. Marvel wasn't really building characters up for the most part. Marvel was moving towards the direction of Secret Wars and with Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers and so on and so forth. And so the collapse of the multiverse was happening. Things are basically beginning to come to a close, and where Gamora had, the power of the Black Vortex, that kind of segued directly into Secret Wars, and then of course it came out with all new, all different Marvel, and she basically was powered down back to her normal self. And so following this, there really wasn't much done with her character at all. And that's one of the things that people were so upset about, is because Gamora does have a pretty interesting history. And for a person who's so dangerous and a person who's so capable, a lot of fans looked at her and said, well, she's kind of wasted here. She got a mini-series of sorts that revisited her past, and it dealt with the idea of Thanos taking her and, allowing her to wipe out, the remnants of, individuals who were still kind of floating around and, get revenge for the fact that her race was obliterated and different things like that. But for the most part, the days of Gamora being this major focal point with regards to her relationships with Adam Warlock or her relationship with Nova, that was long since gone. So again, going forward, with her being in Infinity War as part of Guardians of the Galaxy, the actual movie itself, because of the fact that she seems to be playing more of a prominent role within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and because a lot's being done to build up her character to make her so dangerous, and most likely her and Nebula will end up facing off against Thanos during the events of Infinity War, I wouldn't be surprised if around May, April, June, we start to see these different publications come out. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more information forthcoming about her character. But for right now, she's just another one of these comic book concepts that was designed by a writer somewhere who rose to prominence for a short amount of time and then ultimately just kind of blended in with everybody else and just sort of falls in rank and file. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.